You are sitting next to a person who is dying. There is no hospital, there is no doctor, there is no phone to call anyone. There is only you, the flickering fire in the middle of the night, and the oldest man in the tribe taking his last breaths. And somewhere in that moment, you realize something that scares you more than the death happening right in front of you. That when he closes his eyes, something far more precious than life itself will disappear with him. This is the story of the greatest battle our ancestors had to fight every single day for hundreds of thousands of years. Not fighting against wild beasts, not fighting against natural disasters, not fighting against hostile tribes, but fighting against an enemy with no shape, one that could not be stabbed with a spear or burned with fire, because this is what no one tells you. The most dangerous enemy in human history was not nature or violence or disease. The most dangerous enemy was forgetting. And the evidence of how our ancestors fought it, and actually won, is truly insane in the most beautiful ways possible. Let us begin with the human brain. Because before you can understand why our ancestors had to fight so fiercely to hold on to memory, you need to understand a counterintuitive truth about the brain you are using right now. You do not remember the smell of Tuesday morning last week. You do not remember the 2000th step of your life. You do not remember the face of the person standing behind you in the supermarket line 3 years ago. And it is not because your brain is weak, it is because your brain is doing exactly what it was designed to do. Filter, compress, delete the unimportant to make room for the more important. Neuroscientist Richard Seaman called this the engram, the memory trace etched into brain tissue that fades over time if not reactivated. Forgetting is not a bug, forgetting is a feature. And this is exactly the enemy our ancestors faced every single day for hundreds of thousands of years. Now, to understand why this battle was so fierce, you need to know one thing about how the human brain actually stores memories. For an autobiographical memory, the kind where I was there and this happened to me, all the fragments of an experience need to be pieced together into a complete and retrievable package by a brain structure called the hippocampus. The hippocampus is the brain's memory indexer. Without it, you can experience something, even be deeply affected by it, but have no conscious narrative memory to recall it. In a world without writing, this meant that every time a person died, all their knowledge of terrain, weather, medicinal plants, seasons, laws, history, everything stored in a biological brain with a lifespan of no more than 60 or 70 years, vanished with them, with no backup, no way to recover it. But the hippocampus has a hidden strength we will come back to later, and that very strength is the key to everything. For now, let us talk about why the problem was even worse than you think. Imagine a library adding hundreds of new shelves every day. Books are added faster than the cataloging speed. The organization system keeps changing because new sections are constantly being built. Old books do not necessarily stay where you put them because the shelves themselves are still moving. That is the human brain in its most intense learning state. High-speed neurogenesis creating new neurons constantly, and the process of integrating them destabilizes old connections. The brain is learning so fast that it cannot simultaneously store what it has already learned in a durable way. And what about sleep? Memory consolidation happens mostly during sleep, but the brain does not save files. The brain installs software. It is not storing individual memories, but building the foundational architecture so that everything that follows can run on it. This is exactly how our ancestors thought about knowledge, not as discrete pieces of information, but as a living system passed from one person to another before it disappeared. So what did they do when faced with a brain designed to forget? A lifespan of no more than 70 years and no recording tools whatsoever. They did not solve it by trying to remember more. They solved it by redesigning the world around them so that the world would remember for them. Let us set aside the library image for a moment. Because our ancestors did not build libraries, they did something far more ambitious. And the oldest evidence of that does not require language, does not require community, does not require anything complex. Just one hand and one cliff face. In 2018, scientists announced a discovery at Maros Pangkep Cave on the island of Sulawesi, Indonesia, and the number they gave made the entire archaeological community sit back and read it twice. The paintings of animals and human hand stencils on those rock walls were at least 45,500 years old, older than any cave paintings found in Europe by tens of thousands of years. That meant Europe was not the cradle of this behavior. It appeared in Indonesia, in Africa, in the Americas, in Australia, almost at the same time in cultures with no connection to each other, as if this was not an invention but an instinct. As if at some point in history, the human brain reached a certain threshold and naturally produced the same thing on every cliff face across the planet. And that thing, the thing that appeared first and appeared everywhere, was not drawings of bison or wild horses or hunting scenes. It was hand stencils. Hundreds of caves around the world. Lascaux in France, Altamira in Spain, Cueva de las Manos in Argentina. Not all of them have animals. Not all of them have the same style or the same themes, but nearly all of them have hand stencils. A hand pressed against the rock. A hand blowing pigment around it to leave a positive image. A hand dipped in color and stamped straight onto the surface. And if you stop to really think about why, not in an artistic way, but in a survival way, the answer becomes painfully clear. In a world with no recorded names, no birth dates, no death dates, nothing to confirm a person's existence after they died, one hand on rock was the only way to tell the future that, I was here, I existed, do not forget me. This was not art in the modern sense of the word. This was the first anti-forgetting technology humans ever created. The first time in history, a creature separated a piece of its memory from its brain and placed it into the outside world where it could outlive the body. This was the first step toward what modern philosophy calls the extended mind, the mind reaching outside the skull. But this was its limit. A hand stencil could only say one thing: existence. It could not carry survival knowledge. It could not explain that winter that year, which direction the stream froze, which deep red forest fruit could save 20 lives. If the external storage system was a hard drive, the hand stencil was only a single bit of information. Someone was here. Everything that person knew was still trapped inside their slowly dying biological brain. To transmit real knowledge, our ancestors needed a system that could store not just existence, but everything that the existing person knew. And they built it, literally. The answer comes from a place you have looked at thousands of times in photos, seen on screens, heard about in countless documentaries, and never understood correctly until now. Lynn Kelly is an Australian researcher, and when she published her thesis, much of the academic world responded with polite skepticism covering real discomfort. After years studying oral cultures around the world, Aboriginal Australians, the Yolngu, the Luba in Africa, Mesoamerican cultures, Kelly reached a conclusion so simple it was shocking. Massive stone structures like Stonehenge were not temples, not astronomical observatories, not ceremonial sites. They were physical memory palaces. Every stone, every distance, every angle of alignment designed to correspond to a specific piece of knowledge that needed to be remembered and passed on. Astronomy, agricultural calendars, tribal laws, genealogies, history. It sounds crazy, until you remember the hippocampus from earlier. We talked about its limitations, the memory indexer with a lifespan of no more than 70 years. But here is what we have not said yet. That same structure evolved over millions of years to do one completely different thing, and it does it extremely well: mapping terrain. The human brain remembers space in a way it does not remember anything else. It is not random. For hunter-gatherer ancestors, remembering exact terrain meant the difference between life and death every day. And when you attach information to physical locations in space, the brain processes that information the same way it processes terrain, which is extremely hard to forget. We call this technique today the method of loci, or memory palace. But it was not a Greek invention. It was the deepest evolutionary strength of the human brain, and our ancestors exploited it by building massive physical spaces where every step through them was a reactivation of the knowledge attached to that location. Stonehenge was not a temple, it was the hardware of the operating system. And once you understand that, a lot of things start to look completely different. Chaco Canyon, Poverty Point, the Nazca Lines, not mysteries, not aliens, they were cognitive architecture. They were physical hard drives for societies without writing. Every culture on every different territory, with no connection to each other, independently discovered the same solution, using physical space as external memory for collective knowledge. It was not random, it was the same brain, the same strength, being exploited the same way across the planet. But this was still a solution for settled people. Stonehenge only worked if you could return to the place you built it. And most of human history is the history of people who did not stay still, but constantly moved with the seasons, with the prey, with the water sources. Those people could not carry Stonehenge with them. They needed something smaller, more portable, and older than any stone structure on the planet. That thing existed. The Aboriginal Australians have lived on that continent for at least 65,000 years. And what is astonishing is not what they lacked, but what they had. The ability to move across thousands of kilometers of the harshest desert on the planet with an accuracy that European explorers in the 19th century still could not comprehend. No paper maps, no compass, no GPS. Their secret was song, not song for entertainment, not song for worship, but song as technology. Each song described a specific route through the landscape, with rhythms corresponding to the actual terrain, fast sections for flat ground, slow sections for climbing, pauses for important stopping points, and the lyrics encoded practical survival information. What kind of soil had groundwater underneath? Which trees were edible in this season? Which direction to avoid floods? This was not poetry. This was the operating system of a civilization, stored in the human voice and passed unchanged from generation to generation for tens of thousands of years. But a songline was not a single song from one tribe. It was a network, many songs from many different tribes crisscrossing the entire continent like threads in a giant fabric. At the intersection points, tribes would meet to update information in real time, new water sources appearing, paths changed after floods, new dangers to avoid. There was no central server. There was no single point of failure. Modern software engineers call that architecture a distributed system. The Aboriginal people built it 65,000 years before the first computer was created. And because knowledge was distributed across many people, many tribes, many songs, the death of any one individual, no matter how important, was never the absolute catastrophe like the scene of the dying elder in the opening. The system was designed to have no single point of death. And this is the part that silences all skepticism. In 2020, researchers Patrick Nunn and Nicholas Reid analyzed folklore from more than 20 different Aboriginal groups along the Australian coast, and discovered that those stories accurately described sea level rise events after the end of the last ice age, from 7,000 to 18,000 years ago. Not one story from one tribe. Dozens of stories from dozens of completely independent tribes, with geographic details so specific they could be cross-referenced directly with modern geological maps. Coastlines that once extended much farther than today. Lands that once existed where there is now ocean floor. Oral memory had preserved an accurate geological event from 18,000 years ago. The Sumerian writing system, the oldest known writing system, is only 5,000 years old. Those stories are 3.6 times older than writing. And they are still accurate enough that modern geologists can use them as reference material. But songlines were still a system that required human initiative. Someone had to choose to sing, someone had to choose to listen, an entire community had to choose to pass it on. Everything we have seen so far, hand stencils, Stonehenge, songlines, had one thing in common. It required at least one person actively choosing to continue that chain. The next question is deeper and far more surprising. Is there any mechanism that makes memory transmitted without anyone deciding to transmit it? The answer relates to something our ancestors understood about the human brain thousands of years before science gave it a name. In 1998, two philosophers Andy Clark and David Chalmers published a thesis that many in the academic world initially considered too bold. Memory does not reside inside your head. It resides in the world around you. When you write a reminder note on your phone, that piece of memory has left your brain and lives in the device. When you ask your partner what appointments they have today, you are using their brain as your external memory. When your room is arranged in a certain way, that layout is part of your cognitive system. What Clark and Chalmers described as a new philosophical theory in 1998 was actually something our ancestors lived with for hundreds of thousands of years without anyone naming it. The hand stencil on rock was memory outside the brain. Stonehenge was a physical hard drive. Songlines were a distributed network. All were versions of the same principle. Memory belongs to the world, not just to a single head. But all those systems could still be lost if no one actively maintained them, if no one continued to sing the songs, if no one led the young generation through Stonehenge, if no one sat beside the dying person and listened. Our ancestors knew this. And they found a way to etch memory into the human brain at a much deeper level, a level where even if the external systems collapsed, the information would still remain, fastened inside by something stronger than any stone or song. That thing was emotion. The human brain has a structure called the amygdala, the emotion processing center, and it operates on a very simple principle. Anything accompanied by strong enough emotion, whether fear, awe, pain, or joy, gets automatically tagged as important and not to be deleted. When the amygdala activates strongly enough, the memory is etched with such high resolution that it can be replayed completely many decades later. This is not modern neuroscience. This is what our ancestors knew through thousands of years of observing themselves. And they built an entire technology around that principle. That technology is called ritual. Ritual did not exist to please the gods. Ritual existed to generate enough strong emotion to make the information conveyed within it impossible to forget. The Maasai coming-of-age rituals in Kenya encoded tribal laws, history, and duties into bodily experiences strong enough not to fade. The Hopi ceremonies in America encoded agricultural calendars, weather systems, and underground water maps into dances and music reenacted every year. Ritual was software running on the emotional hardware of the human brain, but strong emotion only helps prevent forgetting. It does not guarantee accuracy, and our ancestors knew this. They developed sophisticated techniques for controlling distortion that modern psychologists still study. The Indian Rig Veda was transmitted orally through meter for 3,500 years. When a word was changed, the rhythm broke and the error was self-detected. The system corrected itself. Medieval Irish bards had to memorize more than 350 long stories over 12 years of training, and beside every performing bard, there was always another bard sitting and listening, not to enjoy, but to detect any deviation from the standard version. Peer review, thousands of years before science named the concept. All these systems, hand stencils, Stonehenge, songlines, rituals, rhyme schemes, peer review, shared one thing in common. They required at least one person deciding to transmit. But there is one deeper layer. But before we get there, let me tell you about something you are carrying inside you right now that you do not know about. There are two completely different types of memory that exist in the human brain. Explicit memory, the kind you can consciously access, describe as a story, and tell to others. This is the kind that songlines preserved, that rituals transmitted, that Irish bards checked against each other. But there is another kind, implicit memory, the kind that does not live in language but lives in your body, in emotional reflexes, in automatic expectations you do not realize you have. The same amygdala mechanism just mentioned, but this time not creating a memory that can be told. It creates calibration, a default setting about whether the world is safe or dangerous, whether other people are trustworthy or not. You forget the experience, you keep the lesson. The problem is, you cannot check lessons you do not know you learned, you just act on them and wonder why you react in a certain way. Now let us go one step further. In 2013, at Emory University, Brian Dias and Carrie Ressler trained male rats to fear the smell of cherry blossoms using electric shocks. Something remarkable happened with their offspring. The rats that had never smelled it, never been shocked, never met their father, still showed significantly higher fear responses to that smell than the control group. The grandchildren did too. Analysis confirmed, the ULFR 151 odor receptor gene in the sperm of the conditioned rats had reduced methylation. The gene became easier to turn on. The fear had passed through DNA without a single word being spoken. And if you think this is only a rat phenomenon, consider this. Rachel Yehuda at the Icahn School of Medicine in 2016 analyzed blood samples from Holocaust survivors and their adult children, people who had never directly experienced the Holocaust. Both generations showed methylation changes at the same location in the FKBP5 gene, a gene related to stress regulation, in the direction of, the world was once extremely dangerous, be prepared, not a memory that can be told, but a biological adjustment written directly into the DNA structure and passed down through generations. Now apply that to our ancestors, a tribe living next to venomous snakes with yellow and black stripes. The first generation learned through death. The second generation learned from stories. By the 10th generation, the 20th, could some part of that knowledge have become a biological reflex, written straight into the epigenome and passed on without any lesson, without any story, without any conscious decision from anyone? Each generation was shaped by experiences they could not remember, passed down from those before them who were also shaped by experiences they could not remember, not as stories, but as calibration, as an emotional atmosphere you breathed in before you even had language to describe it. And this is where the story turns in its most uncomfortable direction. We think writing was the greatest advancement of humankind, and that is true. No one can argue that. But here is what no one tells you, and it will make you uncomfortable in the way truth often does. Writing is not only a tool for storing memory, it is a tool for erasing memory, not in the direct sense, but in an indirect and far more brutal way. When a culture begins to use writing to store knowledge, those sophisticated oral systems, songlines, ritual poems, professional storytellers, gatherings around the fire to review knowledge together, gradually came to be seen as unnecessary. Why remember when you can look it up in a book? Why train bards when there are libraries? And when those systems disappeared, they did not just take the information, they took an entire way of seeing the world, a way in which knowledge was transmitted through relationship, through ritual, through the body, through lived practice. Socrates, who lived right in that transition period when writing was beginning to replace oral culture in Greece, saw this with astonishing sharpness. He said writing would create forgetfulness in the soul because people would remember from the outside instead of from the inside, would seem to know many things but actually know nothing. And looking back at what we just said about implicit memory, this is exactly that trade-off. Writing expanded explicit memory to infinity, but at the same time it shrank implicit memory, the kind of memory that lives in the body, in reflexes, in a deeper way of seeing the world that cannot be read from a book page. When you use your phone to store a phone number, you never remember that number anymore. When an entire culture does the same with its knowledge, what happens to the deeper kind of knowing, the kind of knowing through the body and practice? Socrates said it 2,400 years ago. We are living in the world he described, but at least the shift to writing was a natural process, even with its losses. What happened next was not. The Aboriginal Australians lost their songlines not because they chose to abandon them, but because Europeans arrived, took the children to school, banned their mother tongue, and broke a transmission chain that had lasted 65,000 years in a single generation. The Irish storytellers were replaced by the British education system, with textbooks. In 2 generations, what they knew vanished completely. The Quechua in Peru were forbidden from using quipu, the sophisticated knotted string system for storing and transmitting information, by Spanish colonizers because it was considered witchcraft. The gap between an Aboriginal storyteller singing a songline to a grandchild by the fire and colonial policies banning the mother tongue is one of the greatest cultural crimes in human history. It did not kill people with weapons, it killed memory with enlightenment. And we are doing something similar to ourselves, with algorithms, with notifications, with endless content designed to capture attention and leave nothing in memory afterward. We have more information than any generation in history. We also remember less than any generation in history. So how did ancient humans pass on memories that were about to disappear? With everything they had, with hands pressed against rock, with songs carrying maps of an entire continent, with stones placed in the right positions so that every step through them was a reactivation of memory. With rituals practiced every season with enough emotion that the amygdala would never allow deletion, with fear etched into sperm and passed to the next generation without a single word. And with the most important thing, by deciding that the memory was important enough for someone to sit and listen. When you tell your child a story before bed, you are doing what our ancestors did by the campfire 50,000 years ago. When you learn a song and cannot forget it even if you want to, you are experiencing the same mechanism the Aboriginal people used to store 65,000 years of knowledge in the human voice. When you react to something in a way you cannot explain, that could be the implicit memory of previous generations speaking through you. Those threads did not break, they only became invisible. The old man in the opening scene, he succeeded, not because his memory lasted forever, but because there was someone sitting beside him, listening, and then standing up to tell it again. That person told it to others. That chain has never been broken, through however many winters, however many tribes dispersed, however many languages disappeared. You were not given a receipt. But we, you, me, all of us hearing these words are living proof that what was more important than the receipt has been preserved. We are remembering. We have always remembered.